As I mentioned at the tail end of the roundtable, we do have some additional programming to present to you tonight. Hope you refresh your adult beverage and whatever snacks are appropriate. And please do stay tuned because we have a pre-recorded session from Siobhan Ciresi that I hope you will all enjoy. This first segment runs about 20 minutes, and there is a second segment that follows. And I will break the two segments with a little bit of bumper music to give you a chance to refresh your beverage in between. Please do stand by. Here we go.
Welcome to Operation Humanity Transcending, Part 1 by Siobhan Ciresi. Chapter 1, Waking Up. Ring the alarm. A tsunami of truth and revelation is sweeping our land, and indeed the entire planet, from the origins of our existence to our global enslavement. Whistleblowers, insiders, truth-tellers, and professionals from all paths of life are disclosing and revealing the jaw-dropping realities of our world that the majority of us do not get to hear about. Information is spreading like a wildfire, and it cannot be tamed. It needs to annihilate the old paradigms that have kept humanity in a state of disempowerment and mental slavery for thousands of years. And that's exactly what is taking place right now. Concepts and institutions that we are born into and ruled by are busting at the seams, making way for new actualities to come into existence and take their place. The amount of information available is endless thanks to people working independently and in collaboration to shed light on the darkness that obscures our collective sight. They've been doing a tremendous job in their service to humankind by speaking out and sharing profound knowledge with the world. We are so fortunate to be living in the midst of an information explosion, for now we have an adequate amount of knowledge to comprehend the bigger picture of who and what we really are, where we have been, where we are now, and where we are going. No longer will we be manipulated to live in ignorance, for humanity is expanding its individual and collective understanding about our world and, more importantly, ourselves. We begin by actively questioning and investigating the consensus realities we adhere to on a daily basis, the stories told by our powers that be, which we base our lives on, are long overdue for examination and assessment by the public at large. Government, banking, economics, state education, and religion are just some examples of the current world order that most of us had no hand in consciously creating, but nonetheless our lives, our thoughts, and our beliefs are based on and revolve around these very institutions. The time has come to pay closer attention, to rely on our own intelligence and embrace our innate ability to discern whether or not these institutions have a place in our existence anymore. Do they support humanity or hold us back? Are they representative of what we really want, or are they simply ways by which we can be controlled? Are we truly free citizens in America, or have we been manipulated into just thinking we are? Answering these questions requires a look at some facts, evidence, and history. The hidden knowledge, the deeply significant realities have not and will not become known to us through the nightly news, high school textbooks, our churches, or other institutions that provide us with what we assume to be valid information. The very basic process of research, investigation, and discovery has uncovered the truth regarding some of our most basic assumptions. Coming to know these truths will profoundly change the way we view ourselves, the world, and life in general. When we seek to understand our surroundings and environments in the broad sense, we come to realize that we operate under deeply ingrained paradigms and concepts that we were born into and programmed to live by. When we take a step back and look at the finer details of the bigger picture, we can recognize what we unwittingly uphold. These moments of realization are momentous. With each revelation, we become more conscious. From here, we can start asking the right questions, discover more truth, and make better, more enlightened decisions and choices as a result. The information surfacing for us to finally see has the capacity to launch our individual and collective consciousness into new ways of living and being. For example, up until around the turn of the century, we assumed that our genes controlled our destiny on this planet. You were born with certain genetics, these genes were set in stone, and they determined your biology. Now we know from the science of epigenetics that DNA blueprints passed down through genes are not set in stone at birth. In fact, genes alone do not determine our earthly destinies for us. Nutrition, stress, emotions, and environmental influences can modify our genes at a measurable physical level. We are all modifying our DNA on a regular basis just by doing things we naturally do, like eat, think, feel, and observe. Only we haven't known that. Now that we do know, we can do it consciously. We can be aware of what kind of information our DNA is receiving from us. Not only can we reprogram our DNA, but these upgrades, downgrades, and modifications of all kinds can be passed on to future generations. And the source for that is Reich and Walter, 2001, Ciresi, 2001, and Bruce Lipton, 2005. Literally everything we do, say, feel, and think directly influences our genetics. However, our ability to affect physicality is not just limited to our genes. Pioneering quantum physicist David Bohm uncovered through his scientific work that, quote, "We are all linked by a fabric of unseen connections. This fabric is constantly changing and evolving. This field is directly structured and influenced by our behavior and by our understanding." David Bohm, Shift Report 2008. This field and everything in it is influenced by each and every one of us. And what a breakthrough this discovery is. This means that in expanding our understanding and changing our perceptions and behaviors, we can consciously modify our surroundings, circumstances, and conditions, even our physical DNA. Simply put, we affect reality, and we cannot escape that responsibility, no matter how much I or anyone else would like to sometimes. Another long-held assumption is that our scientists over the centuries were the first to ever discover our solar system and all the planets that inhabit it. But as we dig deeper into the Earth, archaeology continues to reveal hidden history from farther and farther back into time. Experts now know that our solar system was accurately mapped out and recorded by an ancient high civilization known as the Sumerians. This civilization inhabited ancient Iraq some 5,800 to 6,000 years ago. These ancient peoples charted every planet in our solar system, named and described them in detail, including color, size, and unique planetary tilts. Interestingly, the Sumerians described the planets from the perspective of looking in from outside the solar system, counting from the outer planets to the inner planets orbiting our sun. Evidently, modern science is learning what the ancients already knew. Only within the past few centuries has our civilization discovered outer planets such as Uranus, found in 1781, Neptune, found in 1846, and Pluto, found in 1930. In 1977, the space probe Voyager 2 was launched into the outer realms of our solar system, and our civilization saw these planets for the first time in our known history. Amazingly, the images sent back to Earth were exactly as the Sumerians recorded in their 6,000-year-old descriptions of our solar system, confirming that our modern-day scientists are in reality rediscovering the planets. Phenomenon, The Lost Archives, 1992. Talk about paradigm busting. The discovery that ancients had extensive knowledge of the cosmos, that they knew in detail then, about planets, which we recently found ourselves, suggests that our history is richer and more complex than we could have ever imagined. A closer, more personal supposed fact is that our government here in America is still representative of its citizens. This is one of the more sensitive topics explored in this book. It's unsettling to contemplate and downright hard to swallow, the various ways in which our government deliberately manipulates our minds and hearts in order to further their own self-serving agendas. From our slumber, we awaken to discover that we have literally become economic slaves to an elite ruling class, and right now we are in the midst of a countdown, a debt bomb getting ready to blow. Simultaneously, and not by coincidence, we are on the verge of ushering in global government. As we will see in later chapters, the blueprints, plans, and even some mechanisms are already in place for an easy transition from a once free, sovereign America to an America where our laws no longer apply, but are subordinate to international law. Quote, everything is in place for a world governmental structure. We have a global body that is growing in power. We have a situation whereby a global tax is imminent. The global army is operational, and a global currency is right around the corner. End quote. Joan Vion, One Nation Under Siege, 2006. In 1974, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Trilateral Commission member, and Council on Foreign Relations member Richard Gardner published his article called The Hard Road to World Order in the CFR's Foreign Affairs. In it, he states that, quote, the House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. But an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish far more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. End quote. D.L. Cuddy, Ph.D., A Chronological History of the New World Order. Instead of using force to accomplish this goal of a new world order, we are continuously lied to, manipulated, deliberately made confused and distracted. World government has been at the very least decades in the making, but it has been shrouded in secrecy. Those courageous enough to publicly expose the agendas of global government over the years have been subjected to ridicule, slander, and suppression. But it is no longer a secret, for the powers that be are now openly discussing their new world order as they lead us into it. We can no longer ignore the facts about our government and where they are taking us. We need to open our eyes and see what is really in front of us. Individually and collectively, we've got to muster up the courage to assess the cold, hard facts so that we have a clear understanding of what is really going on in our country and the world, and just maybe free our minds and ourselves in the process. Let freedom reign. When I reflect on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I find it impossible to not be deeply inspired by the wisdom and enlightenment these reveal to us. In these revolutionary documents is the key to a free nation on this covertly oppressed planet we call Earth. If the human family has to have government in the manner that we do, then the concepts and power structure that the Bill of Rights and Constitution provides is the only form of government we should allow to be implemented. Our Constitution, our tangible foundation, evolved out of a necessity for the entire human race. In a world where civilizations have been dominated by the few for as far back as we can see, it is the prime example of a society that finally acknowledges liberty, freedom, and justice for all as fundamentally important in the creation of law. It declares freedoms and makes clear what our government can and cannot do in regards to those freedoms. The source of government power is derived directly from the governed, the people that inhabit the land. Through valid representation of the people, laws are to be literally based on these principles. Our Declaration of Independence asserts the most basic, irrefutable truth that we are all equal. Prejudices, circumstances, and experiences aside, every human being is subject to being born, living life, and experiencing death. Not one person is exempt from this higher process of existence. There is no justification for oppressing, dominating, or controlling another. When we opt to control others, we end up suffering for it. The endless manipulating and controlling of others eventually leads to our emotional, mental, or physical demise. For one, it is simply impossible to control another indefinitely. And further, that desire is based in our own uncertainties and insecurities. This false need to control another is the basic sickness of the tyrannical mind. Through our own personal growth and evolution, we can free ourselves from the fear and anxieties that cause us to try and control the lives or experiences of others. Quote, countless people will hate the New World Order and will die protesting against it. End quote. H.G. Wells, The New World Order, 1939. Our forefathers desired freedom so much so that they were willing to die for it. Not die just for their physical freedom, but also mental and emotional freedom from being cunningly and cruelly abused and living in constant fear of more grievances. The original Americans established a system of securing and protecting our inalienable rights, and it's all stated in the Declaration of Independence, but it's necessary to point this out because it relates to what America is experiencing today. The war they fought in their hearts was a battle to reclaim an inherent deeper freedom, and through sovereign laws protect it from tyrants like King George III and would-be power-hungry, insecure dictators of the future. Dying for freedom is something most of us have never had to contemplate. Can we today, as citizens of the United States, imagine being in such a predicament where our only option left to retain our freedom is to reclaim it and possibly die in doing so? Reaching a crucial point in time where our rights have been slowly, quietly, and illegally eroded at the hands of the very institution that is supposed to protect them. This is what the Founding Fathers were up against, and when we inquire into the present-day circumstances of our own situation here, at home, in America, we see that we are not far off from repeating our history. The parallels between the colonists' plight and our own become most apparent when we look beyond mass media, beyond our government's version of events, and decipher the meaning of the facts and evidence for ourselves. A most pressing issue in early America was a lack of reciprocity and negotiation. It was impossible to cooperate with Parliament because the voices of our predecessors were deliberately not being heard nor responded to. Laws were being broken, established, and enforced without representation for the people of America. Not because there was no representation, but because the British monarch simply did not acknowledge the right of the people to be heard and respected. The concepts from which this nation was born are simple, inescapably based in higher truths, and reveal a deep understanding of what freedom is in a society like ours. The Founding Fathers, throughout their own intimate dealings with a tyrannical government, were inspired and led by a force bigger than themselves, a fire in their hearts in which individual freedom from power, tyranny, and control reigned supreme. These true patriots would manifest our sacred law in this very image. It was during the 1760s in America, under the rule of the new King George III, when tensions between the American colonists and the British Parliament began to surface on a large scale. For a full decade before the Revolution in 1775, the American colonies were suffering continual abuses at the hands of the British monarch. This cycle of abuse, doled out by their own leadership, and the colonists pleading for reconciliation had taken center stage. The general feeling of the Continental Congress in 1774 was recorded in the Association, where delegates from the American colonies unanimously agreed that they were, quote, affected with the deepest anxiety and most alarming apprehensions at those grievances and distresses with which His Majesty's American subjects are oppressed, and having taken under our most serious deliberation the state of the whole continent, find that the present unhappy situation of our affairs is occasioned by a ruinous system of colony administration adopted by the British ministry about the year 1763, evidently calculated for enslaving the colonies and with them the British Empire, end quote. This roughly 10-year cycle would breed momentum for a revolution, a complete transformation. Many times over, the representatives of the 13 colonies reached out and made attempts to cooperate and come together with their partner in leadership. They are constantly petitioning and pleading with Parliament for, quote, some redress of their injured rights, to none of which was even an answer condescended, end quote. Thomas Jefferson, 1774. As documented in the Resolution of the Continental Congress on May 15, 1776, we see a weary and dismayed Congress when they discuss the reality of their situation that, quote, no answer whatever to the humble petitions of the colonies for redress of grievances and reconciliation with Great Britain has been or is likely to be given," end quote. By now they understood that these oppressions would not be negotiated and not be stopped. Sweeping changes for the betterment of the established order and for the worse of the people were occurring so fast that our forefathers could barely comprehend the speed at which they were taking place. It was baffling and incomprehensible for them. Thomas Jefferson takes us there in A Summary View of the Rights of British America, where he says, quote, "has been able to emerge from the astonishment into which one stroke of parliamentary thunder has involved us, before another more heavy and more alarming is fallen on us. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions, begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, too plainly proved to be a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery," end quote. It is of key significance to note that in 1764, the British enacted 2 crippling laws against the early Americans. These would light the fire that raged against the colonies for nearly a decade. The Sugar Act was designed to make profits for the already ultra-rich, ultra-powerful, colossal British Empire, at, of course, the expense of the common working class of America. This legislation increased taxes on all non-British goods coming into the 13 colonies, forcing people to pay Britain regardless of whether their goods were from there or not. Basically telling the colonists, buy from us because if you don't, we're charging you anyway. The second law that decapitated true independent and collective prosperity for America was the Currency Act, which prohibited the colonies from issuing their own already circulating currency. The interest-free colonial scrip was the primary medium of exchange for most of the colonies. The British government and their money powers were desperately opposed to this independent, interest-free currency because A, there were no profits being generated through the application of interest, and B, they could not control the prosperity/poverty levels of the nation and its people. Americans were too prosperous, and they had to be put in their place. By forcing the colonists to abandon their interest-free currency, the American people and government had to now borrow any and all money from the Central Bank of England. This strategy worked then as it does today, by placing the country in a state of financial servitude and gaining control, or ownership, if you will, if and when the country defaults on the payback. Surprisingly, the money powers of Britain were not, and to this day are still not, within the British Parliament. The true financial powers actually operate outside and above the law, more like an alliance with the existing royalty of the planet. Mayor Amschel Rothschild of the Rothschild family banking dynasty once said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." A fairly blunt and revealing statement, it rings as true now as it did in the days of the Revolution. When government depends on a private banking monopoly to fund and maintain its very existence, it is by default subservient to its private money masters. Even worse, the land and citizens become the collateral for the financiers. Elite private banking houses, entangled in clandestine partnerships with huge corporations and governments, pulled the strings of the puppets in Parliament then, just as they pull the strings of the puppets in Washington now. Although in our present day, the infiltration is on a global scale. The U.S. Constitution asserts that the government has the sole right to create money and regulate the value thereof. This power was granted from the government to the Federal Reserve in 1913 by then puppet President Woodrow Wilson and a spineless, disloyal, and ignorant Congress. The result, the American economy and entire nation has ever since been in the hands of a small sphere of elites known as the international bankers. We look at the money magicians more closely in later chapters. Rising up as a unified body to stand tall for freedom, the authors of our Declaration of Independence state, quote, "A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people," end quote. By declaring their king unfit to rule and refusing to cooperate with the madness of the monarch any longer, these men experienced a mental and emotional liberation. They further declare that, quote, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between the state and Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we must mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." End quote. And just like that, in one extraordinary, revolutionary, and miraculous point in time, standing in the truth that is freedom, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, by the delegates of all 13 colonies. America was reborn free and sovereign, absolutely self-governing. The Republic was here, a nation subordinate only to what our enlightened forefathers referred to as the Great Architect, not under the rule of any king, any dictator, or any tyrant. Power now rested in the citizens and would be exercised through their elected representatives. A government where fear was no longer the foundation, but one that acknowledges and respects the free will and choice of individuals is primary. Quote, "Leadership that supports a frame of government, productive of human happiness, and where its representative assembly would be in miniature an exact portrait of the people at large. It would think, feel, reason, and act like them," end quote, according to John Adams in his Thoughts on Government. In spite of tainted ideologies existing at the time of the founding of our nation, as they still do now, the core, the very heart of the initiation of a sovereign America, was pure enough to pave the way for new and continuous freedoms to manifest, most of which the majority of us Americans take for granted, not because we are ungrateful people, but because we don't know our history. We are not well versed in facts, nor initiated into the deeper truths of life. We don't truly understand the systems in place that affect our lives. Today's tyranny is harder to decipher. It is more sophisticated and elusive. It happens out of our view and under the radar. That is, until we start looking. You don't know what you've got until it's gone. Now is the hard part, looking at why and how it is that our world is changing so dramatically from what we've known it to be, and how it is that we could be kept in the dark for as long as we have been. Discovering the truth about the matters of our world and our lives can be downright devastating and overwhelming. It can be emotionally trying and psychologically hard to grasp. But more importantly, it can be liberating, freeing, and life-altering for the better of us and our world. It can affect one where they will either be intrigued and want to know more, or they may simply deny the information without investigating it and theorize it off as over-the-top or conspiracy, or say that it doesn't matter anyway, it's always been like this. Sometimes people get defensive or irate with the messenger who is sharing and passing along the information that already exists. So there may be some resistance or denial when we begin to investigate these matters. It is not unusual, but being patient with each other can help, being willing to allow each other to listen or to not listen, and still being there for each other when we decide it's time to know the truth can make this easier on all of us. The more we know, the more we can grow in all facets of our lives. Knowledge empowers us and gives us new, more fully integrated vantage points from which we can actually make more intelligent, more evolved decisions for ourselves. Sticking our heads in the sand is useless when the ground finally gets ripped out from under us. Today in our society and on the world stage, there is nowhere left to hide, for the issues at hand are global and are about to get real personal. It is time to wake up, get in the know, get empowered, and operate from a new level of truth and understanding. Logically, it makes good sense that in order to draw legitimate conclusions for ourselves, we ought to look at all the available information that exists, or at the very least get as much information as we can from all sources, independent and mainstream. A common perspective that feeds our ignorance is the assumption that the mainstream media in general reports accurate news, that they responsibly inform us of whatever we would need to know. This is actually not always the case. There is in fact news that affects each and every one of our lives that is deliberately made off limits to the public and is substituted with extensive coverage of unimportant distractions, such as the finer details of Bill Clinton's or Tiger Woods' acts of infidelity or frivolous political squabbles. In order to comprehend why the mass media as a whole would suppress, control, or spin news, we need to be aware of the reality that the media is owned and controlled by major, powerful super corporations. I'm not referring to the mom and pop store down the street, which is incorporated. We are looking at massive national and multinational corporations. In particular, those that have and seek monopoly over their respective industries. And to deepen our understanding of the situation, let's define corporation. A corporation is a group of people who get a government-authorized charter granting them as one body the legal powers, rights, privileges, and liabilities of an individual. An entity completely separate from those of the individuals making up the group, a corporation can buy, sell, and inherit property. Webster's New World Dictionary. In the 2003 award-winning, brilliant Canadian documentary film, The Corporation, we see how this institution developed and what it has become. As stated in the film, quote, all publicly traded corporations have been structured through a series of legal decisions to have a peculiar and disturbing characteristic. They are required by law to place the financial interests of their owners above competing interests. In fact, the corporation is legally bound to put its bottom line ahead of everything else, even the public good, end quote. Through our calculated capitalistic society, we have been molded to rely on the corporation for everything: food and agriculture, industry, technology, communication, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, transportation, energy, etc. The list goes on as we continually to unquestioningly surrender our trust and confidence to the systems in place. Interestingly, corporations just so happen to be the top contributors to most of our elected officials' campaigns. A good majority of our elected officials now serve the interests of major corporations over the American public, as we simply do not have the large amounts of capital to compete. As a result, close relationships exist between major corporations and governments, which have an enormous impact on our lives. Most of us aren't aware that the blending of private economic enterprise and government control is the definition of fascism. Benito Mussolini coined the term corporatism when he said, quote, fascism should more properly be called corporatism, since it is the merger of state and corporate power, end quote. Whether we call it fascism or corporatism, this is the reality of the current state of our country. And as usual, we have been forewarned in this particular case for almost 2 centuries. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson stated, quote, I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country, end quote. In Jefferson's day, the corporation was widely considered equivalent to a monopoly, the government cautiously issued corporate charters with clear-cut provisions. Later, the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution would create fertile ground for the rapid growth of domineering corporations and their acquisition of greater power. By 1864, Abraham Lincoln would testify to the nation's state of affairs and eerily predict the future of America with this somber statement. Quote, "Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." End quote. For example, after the Civil War, incompetent congressmen and senators alike would accept the bribes of railroad lobbyists, resulting in the confiscation of 200 million acres of American land, a tenth of the area of the entire country, with the stroke of a pen, was taken from the American people and placed in the hands of private railroad interests. You are still being lied to. 2009. Multinational Monitor put together a list of the top 100 corporate criminals of the 1990s after combing through criminal fines that leading corporations had paid over the decades. Their findings were scandalous. Exxon pled guilty in connection to federal criminal charges and paid $125 million in criminal fines. General Electric, who owns NBC, was guilty of defrauding the federal government and paid $9.5 million in criminal fines. IBM was found guilty of illegal exports and paid $8.5 million. Pfizer, the pharmaceutical manufacturer, was guilty of antitrust violations and paid $20 million in criminal fines. Sears was found guilty of financial fraud and paid $60 million in criminal fines. And that's just to name a few. Adapted from the Corporation, 2003. We see that these unchecked Titanics are allowed to go on unaccountable for their operations no matter how destructive their behaviors may be for persons, places, and life from all over the planet, so long as they can cough up millions and millions in fines, which are really more like payoffs. Now, legally, a corporation is subject to the same liabilities as an individual person. What individual do you know that can be found guilty of defrauding the federal government without going to prison for a period of time, for punishment, reprimanding, or hopefully a change in their behavior and conduct? Yet massive corporations aren't expected to change their conduct. They simply pay their fines and continue on business as usual, while the media rarely to never even mentions this abusive, damaging behavior. This is how powerful the corporation has become. We have allowed this institution to flourish unchecked, never collectively understanding, nor examining its potential to morph into a ruling monopoly that dominates countless parts of our existence. And dominate they do. Across the globe, Earth's top 200 corporations' combined sales are bigger than the combined economies of all countries as a whole. The corporation has supreme economic and political power. The reality is that out of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations. Only 49 are countries. Here at home, U.S. corporations dominate the top 200 with 82 slots. Envision this. General Motors is bigger than Denmark. Daimler Chrysler is bigger than Poland. Royal Dutch Shell is bigger than Venezuela. IBM is bigger than Singapore. And Sony is bigger than Pakistan. Unbeknownst to many, the American political system is literally upheld by major corporations. The 82 U.S. companies on the top 200 list made contributions to 2000 election campaigns through political action committees, not including soft money donations, that totaled $33,040,000.
You've been listening to the United We Strike Marathon for Saturday, April 13th, 2013. And that last segment I played was from Siobhan Ciresi of HumanityTransending.com. If you found that information intriguing and might like some more, HumanityTransending.com is the website. And I'm your producer, Gary Hendershot, also known on the internet as Smart Scarecrow. And I'll tell you, it's been a long day for me, and I'm about ready to hit the button and sign off. But I will leave you with one more little ditty before I shut her down. A little bit of Neil Fox. I understand Karen Quintestato likes this tune, so I'm going to close it down on this little number. And that concludes the United We Strike marathon broadcast for Saturday, April 13th, 2013. Hope you enjoyed it. Good night.